When last we left our poor, pathetic victims, player characters, we they had just discovered some new powers, found out that upon hundreds of Fiona Seal's people had been killed, entered a place called the Garden Rest Up, and found out that it was no longer safe. So they pretty quickly were convinced to go through the doorway, which is basically the only other way to proceed, other than backtracking, obviously. One of the things I stressed about the previous sanctuary, and by the way, I'd just like to take a moment aside here. And if you see me doing this, this is what we do for out of character. If one of us is talking like this when we're playing, this means we're not talking in character. It's a good, simple, easy, quick way to be like, hey, this is me talking rather than my character talking. So I still have the habit of doing that, obviously. Anyways, a quick thing as an aside. One of the I needed a term to define these places because dungeons didn't feel appropriate. I was only using the term dungeons because I was using the Zelda equivalent, which as I've mentioned, is a good inspiration for me. I don't like calling them anything else, temples or whatever, because there are actual temples in this setting which have a lot more to do with other things, and I don't want to get the two terms confused. After some debate, one of my players suggested the term sanctuaries, which is why I keep using that term. It's appropriate for several reasons, which are probably already apparent to anyone watching these videos and putting the pieces of the story together. But suffice it to say, when I'm referring to a sanctuary, it is one of these constructed, woven facilities within one of these 4 islands. Okay? Now that we're all clear on that. The second sanctuary, I'm sorry, to backtrack a little bit. The first sanctuary, there was something very important that I kept emphasizing over and over. The overall construction of the place was beatific, incredibly well done, masterfully detailed, and well executed. And as I mentioned back when I was talking about the outer gardens, there was a degree of power necessary in order to weave something like that directly from magic that is at a magnificent scale. This whole facility that they enter is, I'll go ahead and describe this in detail, in brief. It's a bit of a fortress, okay? The vast majority of the outer outskirts that the party goes through is obviously some kind of military facility of some kind, and there were training facilities and barracks and war rooms, things like that, right? Unlike the previous facility, this place is old, and it looks like it. There's dust on the floor, there is the colors on the metals and whatever used to be painted on them on the walls have faded. Any of the signs, anything that was made out of wood is long since deteriorated. There are only the barest hints of what used to be, a table or a chair or anything like that. The only reason that there's any hints at all is because this place has been completely undisturbed during the entirety of this time. Now, there's no insects or anything like that, so there's no webs or anything of that sort. But this place is very clearly abandoned and has been for a long time. So, and this whole facility is like this. As they go through, the very first thing they notice, other than that, which I just mentioned, and the obvious military tone to the place, is the fact that there are piles of of debris, basically, okay? And they're little piles, about this big-ish, and maybe about this tall, and, well, maybe a bit taller than that. It kind of varies, actually. And there's like a pile there, and a pile here, and a pile here. They're basically all over the place in fairly specific positioning. When I actually had the map out, I actually put tiers down for each specific pile so they would know. And after some very careful examination, which they had to do extremely carefully because even just disturbing these things would cause them to crumble into dust, they found out that this used to be piles, what these piles used to be was arms and armor. These used to be equipment. And every one of them is in a little pile as though whoever was wearing it was just kind of it died or whatever, and this is all that's left. Now, there's a lot of things they could assume from that, but obviously that's basically the only information they have at this point. Now, again, as usual, I'm going to skip several of the puzzles and the Zelda-style things they go through, but there are a couple I want to mention here in passing. One is, as they approached a room, they found a locked door, which they used knock to get through, because scions have knock as well, basically. And as they entered the room, they saw it was this large room going out like this, and at the end of it was a blue, actually just past the end of it was a blue shimmering portal. And dozens upon dozens of ghostly images just start screaming at them, and every one of them is just howling, kind of like that. And every single one of them stops at a certain point as they're trying to reach out, and looks like they're being pulled back in, and every single one of them is yanked right back into that blue shimmering barrier that I mentioned. They decided that was a little bit on the strange side, so they decided to be a little more cautious, examined the room for a bit, and determined this was probably some kind of a war room. Before they backtracked, they came across two very unique things, and I want to mention both of these in specific. I've already detailed materia, right? And how it can't be artificially created and stuff like that. One of the things I didn't mention about materia is it doesn't age and it doesn't decay. It doesn't run out over time. It's materia. It's basically as eternal as it is, as people are aware, having only lived and having recorded history going back over a couple of centuries. So at the very least, materia doesn't age over the course of a couple centuries, right? In one of those piles, after some very careful searching and a very good roll on the part of Flux, he found a piece of what was once materia. Now this materia was obviously faded in some manner, but he couldn't determine if it had decayed, as in it had aged and gotten old, or if it had been drained, or if it had somehow lost its magical luster, something like that. But no matter what, everything he knew about the science of materia and the way they work said that whatever happened to it was impossible. He still has that piece of materia with him, that piece of faded materia with him, and that's another one of those puzzle pieces that still hasn't been quite resolved. The other thing they found was what was the other thing they found? They found that there were, this is kind of related, several of the individuals had some more recognizable equipment on them. I say more recognizable because amongst the piles of debris, usually it's so degraded to the point that you can barely even tell that they used to be armor. In some cases, they would actually find what looked like a dagger, or something that had at one point been a robe, right? Now, these items had obviously survived much to a greater extent than the more mundane equipment, but they were still degraded, and after some successful rolls again, they determined that these items were at one point magical, which should also be impossible. It should not be possible for a magical item to be drained or age, and while obviously they had survived better than the non-magical items, the more mundane items, the mere fact that they were like that was another puzzle piece. Now, they decided to backtrack because they hadn't actually found the key proper for that door, and they didn't want to end up trapped on one side or the other, so they backtracked and went down one little aisle, and they found what was effectively I'll go ahead and skip ahead all the flowery descriptions. When I'm GMing, I tend to describe things without just saying, you're in a room that is a prison. I don't like to do that. I like to say, you're in a room, there's a wall, it's very bare, very stark, it's not rough-hewn, it is very well smooth and very well crafted, but there's no aesthetics to it. There's a section over here which has nothing but shadow in it. Even with the light in the area, it doesn't cast any light. I could keep going on, but you get the point. I like to describe these things so they can surmise on their own. Oh, this was a prison. In this prison, they find a hideous little fish person. You may feel free to think of this as a murloc if you wish, but that isn't actually what I was picturing. And it's just sitting there sobbing in this wet little gurgling voice. And after some extensive effort, they managed to basically unlock the prison, turn off the field, and examine the poor thing. And in so doing, they barely manage to communicate, and they get some very basic very basic notes from it. The word help, and the knowledge that it has been here for 4. Now, they don't know for what, but the implication that both players assumed was that it has been here for 4 days, rather than 4 years or 4 centuries, because, shrug. It could have been any of the but all they got out of it was 4. Now, they started following this creature back towards the area, and as it passed down the middle of the hallway, they encountered that barrier that had sucked all those ghosts in that I mentioned earlier, and it stopped there and just kind of stared at it with sort of a pleading, yearning look, okay? And they couldn't get its attention again. It was basically stuck there. So they finally gave up and left it there and continued on their journey down another hallway. Now, this area I didn't actually map out. One of the things I like about mapping out is, okay, anybody who's taken an art class knows what the concept of negative space is, right? The idea, for those of you who don't, is rather than showing something, you don't show something to show it, right? That's a very rough description, but that's the general concept. Thus, one of the things I like about using maps is I actually draw out these maps and set out these maps with the sticks and the pens and whatever, so that when I don't, it is all the more impacting for doing so. By having it be the exception, I can have it be a more, more of a more impact. I don't have a better word. This is one of those occasions. I actually had in the map, there was just this hallway that kind of trailed off into nowhere, and they're like, okay, we go down there, and then we fall into the oblivion, because, you know. That was what I call the domicile. And I went ahead and told them, I want you to give me an amount of time you want to search this place. And they decided on half an hour. They went from room to room for half an hour, going between cooking station and housing area. What they found out is this whole place was living quarters for lots of people. This place was gargantuan, okay, city-sized. And it was every single room, every single hallway had these piles of debris in them, okay? They didn't find anything of note there, not a single thing. They just examined it and went into as much detail as they could, and they determined that this is where people had lived at one point and decided to backtrack. The one thing they did find very close to the entrance, actually, of the domicile, and I mention this now because this is when they found that, was another one of those ugly little well, no, I'm sorry. I'm doing things in the wrong order. As they were coming back, they saw something that looked odd as they were passing by, and it turned out that part of the wall had been caked over, basically. Like this had been a hallway, but someone had forced the brick to grow out in order to block it, right? Because that's kind of how weaving works. And so Flux, you know, activated a few abilities, including Steel Body, so he can smash his way through, broke through the brick, and found another one of those little fish people just kind of sobbing there in the corner. And so they convinced it to come with them. As they got back to the barrier, the two fish people combined into a ghostly visage of someone who looked just like, well, not just like, but was of the same race as Fiernacil. And it looked at them and said, thank you. With heartfelt depth and strength, and faded into the barrier, which then faded away. Both of them were like, no, wait. But obviously there was nothing that could be done about that. So with the barrier now gone, they moved forward. Among the other things they encountered in this area, they found a room that had some echoes of a conversation that had happened once. Now, I don't think I actually described this during the actual game. I don't mind describing it here, because I tried to get this impression across, and I may have failed anyways. What they were seeing were not actually ghosts, but rather echoes of someone of tremendous power who by simply their presence had cast shadows, for lack of a better term, of the event. Does that make sense? And so they got to see this event. Now, it was a conversation between a man named Rytherin, a woman named Airfall, don't make fun of me, and another man whose name they end up learning later. I'll go ahead and tell you it now. It's Mandokir. Of these individuals, Mandokir was acting basically dreadful. Okay, what had happened? Well, okay. The full extent of the conversation was that Rytherin was telling Mandokir, "No worries. We have done everything we can to seal this area. We believe, you know, we will be safe. We will go ahead and fight your war for you." And he said it almost derisively. Mandokir never really lost this feeling of palpable dread, and the whole time Airfall was doing something with her hands, and the players surmised that what she had been doing was actually continuing to weave this facility as they were talking, because she's just that powerful. And even with just the echoes there, they actually had to brace themselves because of the sheer disparity going on. So they got to see that little cutscene, for lack of a better term. As they moved forward, they also found a small shrine, which contained something interesting. As I mentioned in my first or second, I don't remember which, blog, on this island, Vassay-en-Lascelles, there are 3 great houses that manage the politics and military and economics and governorship of the island. As they were examining this shrine, Flux, who had a good deal of knowledge about history and whatnot, and politics, realized that the shrine was in fact a shrine done up in the style of House Redoran's crest, which he found interesting, and it was all done in the colors of House Redoran, which I don't remember what I decided they were at the time. But anyways, it doesn't matter that much. And so they both came to the summation that these people, the survivors of the island were people who had come from these sanctuaries and were people who had originated here, right? Now, was there anything else before they got to the big room? I don't think there was. You'll have to forgive me because we had a couple of big gaps for real life reasons in our sessions, and this whole facility I'm detailing to you right now was actually 3 sessions, just to get through this sanctuary. Actually, I think it was 4. Now that I think about it, 1 session just for the boss. Anyways, so they get to a room. Now this room has a throne in the middle of it, and a lot of little crystal orbs that are sitting on pedestals lining the walls of the room, right? And there are 4 crystal orbs. One is red, one is blue, one is white, and one is green. I'm sorry, no, one is brown, towards the middle. Basically, if you can imagine, this is the throne. Those orbs are like right here, as in within arm's reach to put your hands on them if you're sitting on the throne. So they start going down and trying to figure out what's going on, and a couple of interesting things happen. First of all, Domicile touches one of the crystals and surmises that it was a way of giving a status update on the facility in general, the domicile and the fortress both. Now, the way I presented this, it was clear to her that this had been there had basically been a warning message, for lack of a more lack of a less contemporary term, that had been waiting for someone to respond to it. In other words, no one has actually received this message ever. She was the first one to be through here to receive this message since the event actually happened. What she learned was that there were a grand total of 4 living creatures still detected within the facility, which estimated its total losses at somewhere around the range of 2.2 million. Domicile took that rather hard and was kind of out of it for a bit, and out of the fight, so to speak. She kind of leaned against the wall and was like, "Oh my God, 2.2 million." And yeah, she did the player did a very good job with that, for obvious reasons. Even Flux was just, "Oh my God, really?" And so as they did attempt to continue figuring out, and basically every one of these crystals was involved with day-to-day maintenance and management. You know, there were logs about food stores and production and stuff like that. You know, just basic everyday stuff. I didn't go into too many details because it wasn't necessary. When they got to the 4 elemental orbs, which is kind of obvious what they were, the 3 ones that weren't Earth all said communication. Well, I forget how I said it. You know me, I do tend to think of it in a techie way, and I've apologized to my players for that because I tend to describe these things in a techie way. It's a result of my job, I'm sure. But basically, communication error at the source. You know, as in not here. There's something wrong at the other islands, which made them feel even worse. They connected to the Earth one, and they found out that there was a disconnect. Now, after some very careful thinking, they decided to go ahead and brush the... Oh, by the way, this is actually important for later on. There was some debris on the throne as well. They brushed away the debris on the throne and went ahead and sat on it, and there was like this, and just for a moment they felt a little bit nauseous, but that passed rather quickly, and they stayed on the throne, and as they stayed there, the rooms started to revitalize, okay? I've described this whole facility as decayed, old, dusty, you know, all that thing. All the dust just kind of started fading into the ground. The color on the wall started to come up again. The lights started to come back up to normal level, you know, things like that, right? This whole place started to revitalize because now someone was on the throne, and it was directly pumping their life energy in order to keep the facility maintained, which was a theory that the characters had already. In so doing, he managed to reestablish connection with the Earth crystal and use it basically in order to project his mind across the island in order to see what he could see, right? And it allowed him to have sort of what's the term for that? An out-of-body experience, right? But you could still interact in some vague ways. He couldn't do much. He couldn't actually like pick up dirt or anything like that. But he could magically interact, and in so doing try to detect. It was all a form of a sensor, basically. During this encounter, he something was so immediately apparent to him now that he was looking at it, and it was the wound. I mentioned this earlier. The Deadlands in the eastern part of the island. He saw it, and now that he could see it in a true sense, he see into the ground and into the sky, he saw that the wound actually went up considerably into the air, even though obviously there was no visible, and down quite a ways as well. And he found that interesting and tried to interact with it, and was ejected from the from the orb. It rejected him. He tried again because he's persistent. This time, what he saw was, if you could imagine a person wearing a long robe, like a Jedi robe, right? However, there's no person in it, it's just the robe. But there's still obviously forms of a figure there. It's not just a robe that's dangling, in the wind. But you get where I'm going with this? A robe appeared, a robed figure appeared, and basically told him in extremely broken English that he needed to stop interacting with this, that he was not allowed to, basically. I went into considerable detail to try and get the specifics of my speech pattern and syntax across at the time. You'll forgive me for not replicating it right now. But the bottom line was, this is something that did not speak like a normal, thinking, sentient human being or whatever. Or any sentient being for that matter. And so he tried to convince it that he was allowed to go into the Deadlands, into the wound, and he failed at that task and was once again rejected, and he finally went ahead and gave up on that idea. And the very next thing they decided was to go ahead and figure out what was going on, because if you'll recall earlier, they learned that there were 4 living creatures in this facility, even though they'd only actually seen 2, and those 2, of course, being themselves. So after some more work with the system, they determined that the 2 living creatures were in a room that was actually just adjacent to the throne room. And after some further looking into, they found that there was a hidden passage right behind the throne. They went ahead and went through this passage, and there was I described this as though there was this massive hallway going down this room, right? Or I should say, it was a massive hallway at one point in time. And looking at it, you could see that this was originally a hallway, okay? But someone or something had gone in and shoved out the walls in both directions, making it an actual room, okay? And there was still debris there. There was still chunks of rock and earth that had just been moved aside as whoever it was had shoved the entire room open like this. There were, I don't remember how many, it doesn't necessarily matter, but there was a little over a dozen blue flames that were hovering in the air, forming a circle around the entire room. There was a pile of debris right in the middle of the room, and a pile of bones just to the right. Now, I love the players who run in my game, but it took them quite a while to muster up the courage to enter this room. And I don't blame them. I am sure most players would be like, no. Sure enough, once they entered, the walls remorphed, and I'm sorry, the wall where the hall was, and sealed them off, so they were now in this room, sealed. And the pile of debris started gushing blood, and the blood started grabbing pieces of debris and pulling it together until this giant, only vaguely humanoid-looking thing was there, with the blood forming the connectivity with the pieces of metal and stone and earth that actually formed its body. And yeah. Now, I mentioned earlier, I just want to discuss this in brief. I mentioned earlier that it is with trust that I can do more interesting things. This is one of those examples. The boss won initiative, and its very first move was to lunge across the room at ridiculous speed, just like that, and slam into Fiona Seal, which put her into downed status. I haven't discussed down status at length because it hasn't really been relevant up until this point. In brief, downed is a new type of status effect I came up with, which is the effective equivalent of being at 0 HP. You're not dead, and there's a bunch of rules that go around it. For example, if combat ends and 3 people were downed but 1 person's alive, the 3 people who were downed get up at 1 HP. However, if you are downed, you can be gotten up in the middle of combat through several methods, which I'm not going to detail here. And if everyone's downed, it is generally assumed that, the enemies then come and actually kill you once they're done with you. Assuming that is what they're after, because, of course, not every enemy is trying to kill you, after all. Moving along. I like that because A, it gives me a great plot device tool, literary tool really, in order to ensure that I can move a story in a certain direction or give me more options depending on what the party does, things like that. And also the fact that it also enables me to have unique rules for resurrection within the confines of my new magic system. But moving along, put her into down status. Boom, 0 HP, just like that. One shot, no damage. Now, after they tried to figure out what they could do, I'm sorry, the one remaining individual, Flux, figured out what he could do about this. He decided nothing and gave up. What ended up happening is the little blue flame came to her, and she felt this voice going throughout her, please, avenge me, avenge me against this monstrosity. And she got up again, full health, and from that point on, she did an additional 1 damage in all of her attacks. And the mechanic is obvious here, but the very next thing that happened is well, I guess I don't need to detail all this in detail. I'm sorry. I'm going into too much detail. I put a lot of thought into this boss. I was rather pleased with it, and it turned out to be awesome. As usual, the players turned out to be awesome, too. They came up with a strategy I hadn't even thought about, which I won't go into. They ended up defeating it, and as usual, 8 crystals came out of the debris. And, let's see, what did they choose from those ones? Flux chose an ability that basically, it feels hard to describe, yet it isn't, because every time I describe it, the person's like, well, wait, so it's just, yeah. Basically, your melee range extends to about 30 feet. Visually, the way this works is if I swipe at the air here, but I'm intending to hit that guy who's 30 feet over there, I'll hit him, even though I'm doing a melee attack. You follow where I'm going with this? Now, the range goes up and the duration goes up over levels. But for someone who is primarily, at least to date, a melee-heavy individual, that's been very useful for him, and he's already used it more than once. Untitled chose a, what did she call it? Sniper Crystal, I believe, which is an ability I actually referenced earlier, where she generates this massive crystalline spike, which will then unerringly shoot towards a destination individual you target, and impale them with great force and grievous force, which will do a lot of damage and will cause them to bleed profusely for several rounds. Having chosen their given abilities, they decided to examine the room more closely, and Flux came upon an awesome idea which I loved. He took pieces of the bone and of the debris and interacted with the flames that were left around the room, and in so doing, the flame was released, basically. The soul of that particular member of Firnaseal's race was freed, and he did this in kind, so every single one of them was allowed to move on rather than stay there in torment. I thought that was pretty cool myself. Somewhere in here, I believe it was actually earlier in the throne room, they finally get the name of Firnaseal's race, which is the Scions, and so I'm going to start referring to them as that henceforth. I actually meant to just now, but anyways. Next thing they did is after freeing the various psionic souls that they had done so, they examined the end of the room and found that there was another area where the area had been bricked in, just like before, and they went ahead and smashed it forward, and they found a teleport pad. After it took some effort to actually activate this pad, because this pad was not part of the actual network from before. Obviously it could connect to it, because that's dependent on the individual, but it was designed to be something that was directly leading towards this next facility, which I will cover in my next video. And that's going to be kind of a long video, because they have spent a grand total of 3 sessions in there, and that may not sound like much, but oh my goodness. Anyways, sorry, I should stop teasing. I'll talk to you guys later.